I sometimes go to my favorite restaurant to write a sermon. Yeah, I know that sounds a little unlikely, but I know the people there usually. There are a lot of folks who come every day like me. And the warmth and the food and the kind of quiet that I find there seems to help me. I take my newspaper. That's in case I can't figure out what I'm going to say. Maybe I'll find something there. I also take a Sudoku puzzle to distract myself from having to write, and then I sit and I try to write. On the day that I was trying to write this sermon, there was a woman who came and sat at the table to my left, and she sat down with 4 boys. And I noticed her. I probably wouldn't have noticed her, but I noticed her because she got up and she went over to a table not far away from me, and she picked a purse up off from the chair there and brought it back and said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And then as she sat down, she remembered that the 2 people that were sitting at that table had moved to the back, and so she took the purse back to them. Then she came back to sit down with her sons, and I turned to her and I said, "That was a wonderful thing to do." Well, then her sons piped in, "Yeah, Mom, they should give you the Elgin Citizen Award." Well, it turns out they did give her the Elgin Citizen Award. So she started telling me the story of how that happened. She was going home one night, and there was a man in front of her, a young man, and his car began to slow down, and he slumped down in his seat, and she saw this. So as he pulled over, she pulled over, and she gave him CPR. And this was at 8:30 on an evening on Randall Road. There were cars whizzing by. She was there on the ground administering CPR. And this was a young man who had just played a 2-hour hockey game, and his heart stopped. Well, later on that year, they gave her the Elgin Citizen Award because she saved his life. Now, while I was sitting there, I was trying to figure out what to write. And then her name was Donna, shared with me that wonderful story, and it gave me courage to continue to be able to write that day. It's really important, the stories that we tell. And I was struck by how important it was that day when she told her story. Well, today we're going to hear Matthew's first story, his very first story about Jesus after he was born. And Matthew understood the power of a story. So listen carefully to his story today and the images that he presents to you, and we will reflect on those. Our text is from Matthew, the 2nd chapter, starting with the first verse. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at his rising, and have come to pay homage to him." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that star had stopped, They were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offer him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. If you were to tell a story about a person that you love, what story would you choose to tell first? Stories reveal something about the people that we love, and in this case, in Matthew's case, he was probably sitting as he began to write the Gospel of Matthew, as I was sitting in that restaurant trying to write a sermon, asking himself, what story can I tell to introduce this gospel, this good news of Jesus Christ? What would be the right way to begin? Matthew understood how important images were, and he created for us today an image of the Christ that he wanted to communicate throughout his whole gospel in the story of the wise men. So today we are going to look at the images that he creates for us and reflect on the question, why would Matthew tell this part of the story? What was he trying to tell us about Jesus? Well, you notice in the very first image, your attention is brought immediately to some rather strange-looking characters who are walking across the desert. You might be asking yourself, who are those guys? And what are they doing? Well, those guys, the wise men, were not very Hebrew-looking. And as it turns out, Matthew was writing his gospel to a Hebrew audience. So why would he start out with an image of these strange-looking characters kind of wandering across the desert? They were from faraway Persia, and they were bringing gifts, but they didn't exactly know where they were going. But there they were in Matthew's story. At the very beginning, there was a biblical scholar who once said that the wise men looked something like a company of Ayatollahs wandering across Nebraska. And indeed, that's how strange they must have looked to his Hebrew readers when they first looked at his gospel. What do you think Matthew was telling us about Jesus in that image? Well, perhaps he was trying to tell us that Jesus did not just come for his own people, his own nation, that there were people that were streaming to him from some faraway place at the very beginning. Jesus was never to be one to just appeal to his hometown. His reach was going to go out to the far corners of the world. And the people of Judea, it turns out, didn't even much notice that he had been born. But these folks were already on their way, trying to find him. The next image that we see in Matthew is the image of the wise men coming toward Jerusalem. Now, you'll remember that these were not people who knew the Hebrew Scriptures, so they really did not exactly know what they were doing when they were journeying along. So they came to the place where they thought there would be someone who could instruct them, where the scribes were, where the priests were, the folks who knew the Scriptures, the holy books. And so they came into Jerusalem when they had one question, and their question was, where is the one who was born King of the Jews? Well, in the process of trying to discover the answer to their question, they encountered another person who thought he was the king of the Jews, Herod. And because they were trying to find Jesus, and they sort of bumped into Herod, they had upset him deeply. Herod became very disturbed. And because of that, and he was on high alert, there were unintended consequences of their search, tragic ones that occurred later on that maybe they never even knew about. What do you think Matthew was saying here? Perhaps he was saying that this child that was born, that the folks in Judea did not even notice, was somehow a very powerful person, even when he was just being born. That his presence in the world was going to disturb the most important people who inhabited his world politically. You know, Jesus was barely able to walk and talk before he was getting the person who thought he was the king of the Jews to kill all the 2-year-old babies in and around his home. The third image we encounter is a beautiful image. It is the image of the wise men bringing their gifts to Jesus. And by the time they finally arrived, this was a 2-year journey. I can't imagine walking through the desert for 2 long years, but they had spent 2 years searching, and finally, when they found Jesus, they bowed down, they brought gifts, they worshiped, they were overjoyed. This is the first image in Matthew's gospel of true worship. And he wants us to see that, to see what true worship looks like. But the thing that ties all of these images together, the thread that flows through them, is the journey itself. The wise men were willing to strike out. They were rather adventurous, I believe, the type of people who would want to check something out that might not be that easy to find out. They were seekers. But it wasn't just the wise men that brought them to the place where they discovered Jesus. God was there beside them all the way. God was actually seeking the wise men before they even started out, prompting them in quiet ways, making them want to find what was going on when that star rose up in the sky and they looked at it. God was like a hound of heaven pursuing them, even though they weren't Hebrew, even though they probably didn't have the right beliefs that would exactly coincide with Matthew's gospel. But God was still after them, guiding them along. And when they finally came to the place where Jesus was, because God was with them, they did not just turn around and go home. Now think about it for a moment. They walked in to a house on the poor side of town where there was a toddler, a 2-year-old, no less, that they were to worship as king of the Jews. How would they know that this was the Christ child? How would they know this was Messiah unless God was beside them, helping them to understand that this is the one, this is it? And when they turned to go back home, they probably thought their adventure was over. They knew how to get home. They just didn't know how to get where they were going. But when they turned around, God was still with them. God was speaking to them, telling them, don't go home the way you came. Bypass Jerusalem. Bypass Herod. Go home another way. Who would have known the twists and turns that their journey would take? Who would have known that the day that I was trying to write this sermon about this issue, that a woman would sit down at the table next door and tell me a story and help me to understand what it was that I needed to say and lift my heart and give me encouragement to write, encouragement to preach. Journeys are so much a part of our Christian life. And our journeys sometimes take us far away places like the wise men. Sometimes they happen right in our own backyard. But always, our journeys with God are worth the trip. Today, as I close, I want to share with you a poem that has been a part of my life for many years. It is a poem that speaks to the wisdom of the story of the Magi. These are its words. If we, as Herod, fill our lives with things and again with things, if we feel ourselves to be so unimportant that we must fill every empty moment of our lives with action, when will we find the time to make the long journey across the desert, as did the Magi? For each of us, there is a star to discover. There is a desert to cross. And there is a being within ourselves to bring to life. Amen.